What is a game? We could define games as rule-based, structured forms of play, sometimes fun, sometimes educational. Even when we're barely able to walk, we're beginning to develop an understanding of the world via the logic of games. For example, I roll the ball to you, you catch it, you roll it back to me. As we grow, these games become increasingly complex. Strategies are introduced. We learn that we can alter the outcome by changing the way we play. Some games are incentivized with a reward for the winner and a forfeit for the loser. And when multiple players are introduced, we try to anticipate the myriad possible moves that our competition might make. The language of games permeates our socio-political spheres. If someone successfully engineers a social situation, we might say, well played. If someone dates promiscuously, we call them a player. When someone's got riz, we say they've got game. When Trump is playing, we say Trump is playing 4D chess in the trade war with China. We wait in suspense to see who will make the next move. We refer to those we consider boring as non-player characters or NPCs. On TikTok, we maximize our social appeal by collecting aura points. In 2023, Ben Davis published an article on the notion of quantitative aesthetics, a term for this era's tendency to let data points dictate taste. In it, he wrote about the way that social media numbers, clicks, likes, shares, retweets, etc., seep into everything as a shorthand for understanding status. While the idea of an art object's value being tied to its price, or even the straightforward rankings of music charts, is nothing new, the rise of quantitative aesthetics marks a deeper shift. Subjectivity and uncertainty are replaced with concrete metrics that can be tracked, optimized, and climbed. It's a framework for gamification, where every interaction becomes a move in an endless quantified game. In this new normal, it's not just the pervading language of games framing our social, professional, and political lives. Their strategic and aesthetic qualities also serve as frameworks for dating apps. We swipe and select our players, they swipe and select us, all the while the algorithm learns our desires. Duolingo transforms language learning into a streak-based grind, leveraging guilt and reward loops. Everywhere, the attention economy thrives on the exploitation of desire, trapping users in cycles of engagement designed to feel like play. But what happens to a game when its rules and structure begin to erode? When the metrics no longer measure meaning, when the gamified shell remains but the play itself hollows out? What trade games might emerge out of Trump's tariffs on China? And how seriously should we take meme coins? I'm delighted to be joined here today by Zhexi Zhang, an artist exploring cosmology, technology, and economy. Recently, he exhibited at the 9th Asian Art Biennial, edited Catastrophe Time, and toured Dead Cat Bounce with Waste Paper Opera. He's an affiliated researcher at Serpentine R&D, British Council, and Centre for AI and Culture, NYU Shanghai. I'm also joined by writer and creative producer Halle Frost, editor of Weird Economies, a journal, programming space, and podcast exploring economic imaginaries in contemporary finance. She serves on the board of Arts of the Working Class and is the founder of Halo Creative, a design collective working under the ethos of spiritual tech. Please give Gary and Halle a warm welcome. Okay, so I'll start with the main question. So I'll start with you, Halle. Could you please define gamification?
Yes, thanks Hannah. Thanks everyone for being here. This is such a special moment and I'm really grateful to share the stage with Gary as well. Since producing The Exploits of Play, which was the podcast that talked about gamification for Weird Economies, I have had about 14,000 conversations that start out with, what is gamification, right? And I work as a product designer in tech, and then I'm also have my hand in this academic art world. And so the word gamification actually comes from, in 2002, the UK designer Nick Pelling he says, you know, we should make digital interfaces look like games. Kids will love it, right? And this is also around the time that the Apple designers are working with skeuomorphism, which is a design concept which basically just says that the trash bin on a computer should look like a trash bin. We should make the iconography of digital spaces mirror that of the material world in order to get people to use these interfaces, right? This was the early 2000s, and that was gamification then. And now we're talking about gamification 20 years later with the advent of algorithms, with the proliferation of social media apps, and designers who are designing these apps use gamification to measure user minutes, which is the gold rush for a product designer, right? It's how long you can keep people on an app, regardless of whether they're fulfilling the desire for which they downloaded the app for, right? I'm talking about people on Tinder who the desire is love and connection, and they're getting badges and little dopamine hits for swiping, and they're also getting advertised to, which is the goal of the people that have designed Tinder. So gamification now in the product design world is, depending on what side you're on, it's called dark UX, so it's actually a pretty negative thing, but we're all susceptible to it. I'll say that I am very personally susceptible to it. And when we're talking about gamification in the art academia bubble, the podcast that I did with Max Haven for Weird Economies was researching by way of just interviewing a lot of very smart people about how games have entered the digital sphere from a place of play. We looked at alternate reality games with Hugh Davies. That was really interesting. We also interviewed Sonia Amade, who is an economic researcher, and she took us through the origin of game theory, which is a applied mathematical concept that comes from the Cold War era, but is taught as like economics 101. Everyone is going to learn this framework for human behavior, which we also understand to be very reductive and not humans don't primarily compete. There's also an element of cooperation whenever whether we're on the global scale or intimately. And game theory, unfortunately, has us constantly thinking of the other as dangerous, in need of disarmament, and for ourselves, it creates a sort of isolationist perspective in which we need to arm ourselves against the impending threat of the other. So I think that's a pretty good overview of where I'm coming from with gamification, but I think throughout the talk we'll go from having because Gary also comes from a UX background, so we'll be talking about gamification from that very practical product design perspective of like what's in your phones that you're using every day. And then we'll also be talking about it in terms of what's happening within this less tangible art academic bubble we're all a part of. So yes, thanks, Hannah.
Great, thank you for that. Gary, how do you define gamification?
I mean, we just got a great definition. I think I would only add to, I think we mean a number of different things by gamification these days. I think there is the kind of, let's say the kind of industrial UX notion, and I literally just got a Duolingo ping on my phone. But there is also maybe like this wider thinking around, the logic of games, video games, having kind of broadened out into wider logics in society, partly through these interfaces. I mean, I think the people who got hooked on MMOs in the 90s are some of the people who we see now and really understand the logic of what's going on now in terms of like various forms of network culture. And I think, the art world, and especially this kind of meme of world building, like this idea of not just existing as part of a competitive logic, but also creating the game that you can play, becoming the agents in the game, becoming in Silicon Valley these days, there's this term of being a live player, which is kind of the opposite of being an NPC. It's like suddenly, let's say our geopolitics is occupied by live players, people who take forms of agency that might refute traditional rules of the game, don't act as a predicted to act in certain kind of rational actor kind of paradigms and actually just like throw the whole board out, or like really, you know, leverage or change the kind of narrative for everyone else. So there's this kind of question of like, how does refusal and undermining the game also produce you as a player, as someone with greater agency? I mean, I guess alongside that, it's, I think, within our kind of like more immediate kind of art cultural context, I've always been struck by the fact that, you know, myself and many friends, artists are now kind of turning towards game engines, these spaces where you make games inside games, essentially, as a kind of creative medium, because it's very compelling. But I think the art world, you know, spent most of the 2010s trying to get away from agency. We said like everything else is agency except for humans, like you know, ants, slime molds, infrastructures, all of these other things, and now it's like, okay, we can have agency, but only on our terms. Like we can only be the player if we also get to invent this entire fantastical world around us in which we're essentially like the kind of Studio Ghibli style adolescent girl who gets to kind of like be full of wonder and mystery about this wild, slightly spooky, but ultimately winnable game. Whereas actually what we have is this cursed landscape of rubble, unevenly distributed, that is already kind of post-apocalyptic in many ways. But we sort of refuse that game.
Yeah. Fascinating, especially what you were saying about live players, the kind of idea that you can just do things, and this pervading notion that, you know, the world is now run by live players. So Gary, you've written about the relationships between gamified tech and various types of economies and manipulation of users' desires. I mean, it's something that you've both touched upon. You wrote that the internet is designed for your nervous system and the neuro-economic art of facilitating dynamic exchange between attentional time, dopamine, and the prospect of social or economic returns. Could you just explain a little bit more about your research into these connections and how they relate to finance more specifically?
Yeah, so I guess when I wrote that book, or the parts of that book, which was around the same time that you were identifying earlier, around this kind of hinge moment in the very early 2010s, basically, we were seeing platforms grow gigantically over the previous decade. And I was also helping to write a book for a Silicon Valley guy I was editing his book about the growth of Web 2.0. It was essentially a consultancy book. And what I realized during that time was that actually the entirety, this is very mundane, the entire toolkit of the internet, the analytics tools you get, the kinds of different numbers and like ways of analyzing like bandwidth, the kind of like speedy loading AMP kind of things for websites. All of it is essentially designed for e-commerce. Like it's designed for lead generation, it's designed for sales conversion, it's designed for how many eyeballs can you turn into sales at what rate, at what spread, in what places, and how can you move servers closest to the place where those things are happening so they can happen even more quickly. And it's kind of that side is kind of very simple. And on the UX side, you have these like kind of, you know, extraordinary primitives that we built in the last 20 years. The like button, the scroll wheel is almost like it's like almost like a Buddhist kind of like a like a prayer wheel or something. And these kind of the extraordinary simplicity of these things are, as we all know, there to just like feed a kind of neurotransmitter. And that is, it's in itself quite beautiful. It's like a very kind of easy link between ourselves and our technologies through a kind of very simple kind of like psychological mechanism. And as the algorithms get better, and they really do get better, it's kind of sublime. Like when you're in that kind of flow state for scrolling, I think it's somewhat cursed, but it's also incredibly joyful. And so I guess that's when you scale that to the size of however many people are on their phone more than how many hours a day today, which is most of the world, what you have is something that's kind of getting close to what like Pierre de Chardin in the early 20th century called like the noosphere, like the kind of massive networked nervous system of connected brains, which are kind of feeding into this gigantic manifold of essentially neural activations. And yeah, so I guess that's the kind of image that I'm kind of interested in, that we have these private games that undermine our sense of rationality and agency to the individuals. That's all fine, that's interesting, but it's not that interesting. But once you get into this kind of like insane scale of the kind of accidentally connected stacks of billions of people, okay, then we're getting somewhere when we're getting into like this kind of like meta brain.
Yeah. We can
Sorry,
add.
I just had to cut in because you said something so offhand about the action of scrolling being akin to Buddhist prayer beads, or it's the same action of that of the rosary, and like this kinetic action. There's almost there's a historicity of this movement being one in which we connect to the divine, and now we're doing
to infinity.
I mean, you're doing this, but you just let me know about that. My mind is absolutely blown. We need to stop doing that.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more frictionless, isn't it? This kind of symbiotic relationship. Halle, could you maybe describe in a little bit more detail your work with Weird Economies and your work now?
Yes. So Weird Economies was a platform that was founded by Bahar Nurazadeh out of London, and we received a lot of funding for it. And the entire time we had the platform, we were trying to describe to people what it was, because it's called Weird Economies. And I think she was really brilliant in naming it as such, because the word weird at the time was connecting to queer, to outlandish, and what we were doing on the platform was we were funding artists and researchers to go out in the world and look at case studies of places or people that were actually embodying different economic models. So a artist went into Hungary and looked at how there's a group of people rethinking how to do a pension system. We had a group of artists look into shipping, which if you've ever looked into international shipping, it's fascinating. It really, really is, especially post-COVID. And the podcast, so I was just the editor at the time. So I was in charge of trying to make this more academic jargon accessible to a larger number of people. And I was having a really hard time doing that, especially because people's attention for reading online is about, 7 minutes? And I was basically editing down dissertations. So for the last year, we got funding to do a podcast, which I thought, okay, this is a medium that we can disseminate these ideas to a larger group of people. People love podcasts. And we brought on Max Haven to host, who is, talk about games. I just have to plug this really quick. Max has a new game called Billionaires and Guillotines, which is out soon, and everyone should get a chance to play it. And yeah, so Weird Economies, it was a think tank, it's a platform, it was a collection of people who really wanted to get out of the world of theory and into what people are doing on the ground to create like a practice of new economy and new imaginaries. And what I'm doing now, at the same time as I was working at Weird Economies, I was also working in the art world. I was working at a gallery, as one does. This is the first time I've been to an art fair and I haven't been someone's assistant. And I really burned out on working at galleries and curating, and I moved into tech. I did one of these boot camps, and I decided to become a digital product designer because I said, okay, hey, there's so many brilliant people talking about the ways in which we can do these systems differently, but the people that are designing the systems don't seem to be aware of what we're talking about. So my whole idea was that I would move into tech and start designing with the values that were given to me during the period that I worked in Weird Economies. And that's pretty slow moving because a lot of people just want you to design based on what's working, what gets users on their app. But I think slowly I'm starting to find different applications, especially in like the collapse of Twitter. That's a really interesting moment for apps because there's a lot of different social medias that are coming up that are saying, okay, how can we create this bubble a little bit differently? And so, yeah, and when I got out of my boot camp, I was like, I'm going to design under the ethos of spiritual tech. And I had no idea really what that meant at the time, but it aligned also because I was doing a yoga teacher training. And since then, I've decided that spiritual tech is a lot like in the Tantra tradition. Spiritual tech is the combination of like skilled, well-meaning skill and wisdom, the Shiva and Shakti. So that's you're all welcome to join me on this this trip into spiritual tech. So that's what I've been up to, yeah.
So spiritual tech is more than just the frictionless scroll.
Yeah, it's deciding that users are actually people, and we have a finite amount of time on this earth. Our attention is probably our greatest resource, and to not exploit people's lives and attention, but to create an internet that does what the internet does best: connectivity, bringing people together. I don't even know if it's good with language learning, but ordering food.
Yeah. Just on that point, getting deeper into the work that you do now, we've spoken about the term that political theorist Jody Dean coined, communicative capitalism, which describes how digital communication, rather than fostering genuine democracy or political change, gets co-opted by capitalist systems. So I'm interested in your work which uses desire or the exploitation of desire as a starting point. How does your research into what you term or call the entrapment of users through apps relate to the gamification of desire? And ultimately, like, how is this financialized?
Okay, so the Jody Dean article is really fascinating because it's written in 2005, right? And she's writing about the phenomenon of people protesting the war in Iraq and Bush basically acknowledging that these things are happening and saying, you're totally right to have that opinion. I'm going to do whatever I want, which I think is obviously a phenomenon that we've continued to experience over the last 20 years, like most recently. For those of us protesting for Gaza and just feeling this intense frustration that no matter how much time you spend in the streets, the war machine, lumbers on. And in that article from Dean, she's talking about tech fetishism bolstered by a number of different fantasies. And the first of these fantasies is that the fantasy of participation, that like being active and communicating on the internet is in some way connected to a consequence in the real world. When I think especially 20 years later reading this article and thinking about how algorithms have just splintered these bubbles in which we communicate in. So we really are just communicating to one another. And yeah, there's a complete alienation of the language we use online in the society that we exist in within our bodies and our material worlds. And the second part of that question was about desire. Oh, I'm interested in the word desire because during the Exploits of Play, we interviewed Alfie Baun, who's a researcher that wrote Dream Lovers. And I really wanted him to talk about dating apps on the show. I kept like prompting him to, I'm like, what about dating apps, right? But his research is primarily interested in desire, and he comes at it, he says that desire is actually not innate. When we think about desire, we think about it as like this thing that maybe we can't control. It's an urge that we're driven from. There's a subconscious element to it. But Alfie posited that actually desire is something that's constructed within the political, technological, or societal situation that we're in. And he also flipped it and said, that's a good thing. It's a good thing if our desire is something that we inherit from the outside world, because it means that we can be more cognizant and conscious of it. We don't have to be driven by our subconscious. We can instead really choose what and how we desire and move forward within that in the world. And it's funny because in UX we call it needs, and in this context I'm calling it desire, but it's really the same. I want to say that it's maybe the same thing. And when we talk about that, there's like a mystical element to desire, which I guess we love with this line of magical thinking. But then I'm doing a new podcast with my friend who's getting a PhD in psychoanalysis, because we're really trying to talk about desire and normalize discussions of desire, really in order to make it easier to not be exploited by our phones. I think that covers the whole question.
And then sort of thank you for that. And like following the line of magical thinking, Gary, you've egregores come up a lot have come up a lot in your recent texts, and it's something that I was new to me before I read what you sent me in preparation for this event. Would you be able to explain what an egregore is in the context of your research, and its relation to kind of magical thinking, and particularly like artificial intelligence?
Sure. Yeah, I will do that. My mind was racing slightly. I'm just trying to pin a few things that Halle just said down so that I can come back to them. But they have to do with desire and generational shifts in the kind of construction of desire in technology environments since 2005, I guess.
Yeah.
But egregores, so very flatly, egregores, I think I actually came across this term first through Venkat. I think he wrote something back in like 2014 or something. I don't think I even remember digging in around it that much, but just stuck as a concept. It comes from a very unsexy phase of like 19th century, probably, I think, British mysticism. It has, an egregore is a being summoned out of belief. If people stop believing in it, if its believers stop believing in it, it disappears. It is a kind of a belief-based entity, and it's through its existence as a body of belief, it can, accrue certain forms of agency depending on what you're trying to summon or whatever. So there's a kind of active notion of what an egregore could be in a kind of like 19th century seance circle kind of way, which itself, of course, speaks a lot to the technological changes which were going on at that time with the telegraph and all this stuff. I found egregores really useful to think about. I wrote a piece a few years ago which started with this question of like, is a fandom a botnet? So, we have a lot of confusion or thinking around like how users are, or how humans are, whether users are in fact human, how we think about how people act on the internet, and whether we accord these to the kind of rights and responsibilities of people, or to the rights and whatever, or the kind of entities of these kind of like accounts existing as bodies of text that interact in certain ways, and that kind of foreshadows the AI thing. And I guess my thought at the time was that like, okay, well, Web 2.0 has already turned everyone into bots, not in a kind of like wake up sheeple kind of way, more in a kind of like, how do you actually get any handle on a kind of agency in the kind of memetic space of most online forums? Well, you have to kind of, say the line like together. Like you have to be an egregore, you have to be a fandom, a swarm, a kind of a collective. And then if you dig into that a bit, then what is Twitter or other kind of forums, what are they made out of, especially these public ClearNet kind of networks? They're made out of like, I think of it as a bit like surimi. Surimi, like fish balls? You can take like thousands and thousands of fish in the net and you kind of like blend them up into a paste, and then you form that paste into different shapes, like fish shapes, ball shapes, star shapes, and so on. So it's a bit like surimi people. It's like these are, the internet is still made of people, but it's actually everyone part-timing, kind of like freelancing. There's like, a salary man who's like a part-time BTS fan and like a late-night Nazi who like hates his ex-wife, so he goes on some like, red pill forums or something, but actually also has a few meme coins and like gets involved with the GameStop thing. And then the GameStop thing being like a very good example of a moment where, ostensibly, I'm cartoonifying this because the real sociology of it is probably more complex, but like the GameStop thing involved a forum of retail traders, i.e. people the market can normally just ignore because they are individuals. They are individuals without information, without knowledge, without any meaningful access to Bloomberg terminals and stuff, just plebs on the street, NPCs. And they somehow all got together in a large number and made a collective bet on a short seller over the retailer GameStop. How did this happen? It had to do with a lot of narrative, had to do with it blowing up, had to do with Elon Musk tweeting about it. were there undercurrents of it? Well, some of them talked about how, you know, this was a kind of like revenge of the American NPCs against like 2008 even, against this idea of the bankers being this kind of big boogeyman that they finally get to like kind of, like kind of attack. But nonetheless, like this is like an example of like this kind of sudden swarming of lots of part-time activists who decide to get together, assume a certain position, a certain identity, and in doing so becomes a bit like, you know, that image on the frontispiece of like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, like a sort of a person made out of loads and loads of little people. And so I guess egregores for me capture some of this because it's about the trans-individual quality of online agency. Like try your best being an individual who has agency on the internet. Some people can do it, of course. It involves a certain kind of skilling, but becoming a main character is really hard. Being part of a fandom, joining a different, you know, large streamy body or something is much, much easier, and it's very desirable. It's a way you also therefore act like kind of a partial bot, because, you know, when you're in this room, you shout this thing, and it's the same logic as protests. And, you know, there might be something in this in relation to the kind of relative inefficacy of protest in the last forever times. So that's where the kind of, I guess the way that expands a little bit is that I think Venkat probably used egregores in the context of companies, brands, and other kinds of like narrative vehicles. And how you make a vehicle out of narrative and how you steer it is kind of one of the key issues of not only Coca-Cola, but also Israel. Also, like, you know, nations and other kinds of like more supposedly established conceptual kind of like infrastructures that we use to make up our realities. So, you know, in many ways, the bricks and mortars of our imaginary space, of our normalcy, is made out of all kinds of egregores. Famously, money is, you know, somewhat made of belief. The imagined community of the nation, and many other things. So the question, I think, is how do kind of individuals stop being individuals and kind of join larger wholes or partially join larger wholes, and how do these larger wholes manifest into forms of activity? And that's, I guess, where finance comes in, because finance has wound itself more and more tightly within. This is simple, just like monetization of your Twitter account, for example. Just simple, turning your Instagram following into an OnlyFans like monetization channel. That's kind of a nice example because, you know, you get followed by 100K people, and then you go to a platform which monetizes a kind of ostensible one-to-one interaction with those 10,000 of those people, but each one is in a little cubicle thinking they're having a private chat with you, but except it's actually written by an AI. You know, and you know, like my friend Takeshi Shimizu is a wonderful artist. He told me he used to work a job in 2015 or something where he was the guy chatting to the guys in the striptease live chat. Like there was a girl on stage, there were 150 guys giving tips, but each one wanted to have a chat, right? And so, you know, someone's got to chat, be the mouth of this egregore. And so Takeshi was there, typing away, you know.
Wow.
Hey, ASL, etc.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah. That's thank you for that explanation. That, it really tied so much together for me in terms of like understanding these modes of being online. And just to change the subject slightly, but I feel like it's something that feels like it's so relevant to be talking about at the moment. The tariffs, the trade war. It's if we can't be talking about games and finance without bringing that up. So, could you, Gary, please try and explain how, what kind of games are going on, what kind of games might emerge out of this current geopolitical financial situation?
Okay, I mean, my guess, my try is going to be as good as many other people's here, but like, you know, what have we seen? Trump launched like 1 billion tariffs of 1 billion% on everyone in the world. Then everyone was like, fuck this. And then there was a negotiating tactic, it's something else, doesn't matter. He pulled back 2 days later and then only tariffed China. So now we only have tariff wars going on between the only two important economies in the world compared to everyone else. So we're still basically in the same situation of this game being completely, the original game was the WTO. Like, I have there's an artist in China who says something really interesting, that the most important year for him in China in the 2000s was not 2008, where things opened up, the Olympics happened or something. It was 2001, where they got the Olympics, which means that we're going to go on the world stage, and we joined the WTO at the behest of America in some ways. And so, that was to do with this order of liberal free trade, and those to do with like joining the kind of table of like open borders, free trade, and so on. And for the kind of Fukuyaman end of history-ites in the West, that was a major moment of kind of reining China in and bringing China to the table in that way. And now, that particular game has completely reversed in the last 5 years or so. It wasn't just in the current Trump administration, but prior to this, that's Biden's industrial policy. That's it was China that was coming to the courts of the WTO saying that America's not playing by the rules because they're trying to doing massive injections and doing various kinds of subsidies and so on. So that game was already falling apart. And now you have tariffs, which is based on ideologically based on a kind of particular, I think, romanticization of American supremacy in the American success in the late 19th century, which came from a period, amongst other things, very, very high tariffs. That's, I think, part of the kind of nostalgic "we were kings" kind of recall that Trump is working with, but he essentially threw out the board, brought in a new game, and then immediately blinked like 2 or 3 times. And so it looks very bad for the US at the moment. And I guess the only other side to that is that you brought up global shipping. Ryan Peterson, the guy from Flexport, which is one of those biggest kind of global shipping logistics kind of information companies, he said that some of his clients, American producers, are now asking their Chinese suppliers to buy them, which is very interesting because that's not how this game was supposed to go. Like, if that becomes a tendency, that's like exactly the kind of like weird reversal of the stated intentions here. And then the final thing, I guess, has to do with the US dollar. Trump doesn't believe in another defining part of the post-1970s game has been the supremacy of the US dollar as de facto world currency that everyone has to hold and everyone has to use as a safe asset. Trump thinks that the US dollar is, this arrangement is a scam for America because America has to take on loads of debt, or America gets borrowed cheaply, depending on how you look at it. But he wants to, it would appear that he wants to devalue the US dollar and make the US into a more obviously exporting country. So, this I think has to do with, this is one of the main kind of like centerpieces that is trying to be like unshifted.
Yeah. Halle, and as somebody who lives in the US, is anything materially changed in the last week that you've noticed on the ground, from the ground?
Yes, I mean, things have gotten much more expensive. And there's the run on goods that was happening during COVID. I do think, though, that like as a North American, it'll be interesting to see how Mexico is elevated as China and Mexico secure an alliance. And I'm really hopeful for the artists in Mexico that will have more access to the foreign stage because of this alliance with China. But really, I mean, yeah, Trump's not playing the chess or something. He's in a sandbox. Like, I really think the less credit we give this individual on any level is incredibly important, because he's really, I mean, like, we can talk about it on terms here in Dubai, but there's seniors that are losing their social security. Like, people aren't going to be getting their meds, and I actually don't know what they're going to do. So while this is all fun and games, it also means that a lot of really vulnerable people are going to be dying in the next year, and they won't. And the thing is, they don't even know why, because I don't think they know where their checks are coming from. There's just like a huge delusion around it. But there is a social system in the U.S., and it's been just absolutely decimated in the last 2 months. And I think there's going to be a lot of pain that's happening it'll be happening very soon. So
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that. I mean, yes, social security, and also, I don't know this, maybe someone who does, what is going on with pension funds? Because the US stock market is now in danger. Whatever we think of that as in various political stripes, that has been the rule over the last 20 years, that just keeps going up. And that ensures that a lot of people around the world have pensions. US as well, Canada, also most nations probably. And that is literally a kind of, the future for a great deal of people. And so what happens there is anyone's guess right now.
Can we talk about meme coins now?
Sure.
Yeah, lighten it up slightly. Yeah, let's talk about meme coins. What are your guys' opinions on the aesthetics of meme coins?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I actually do, because Hannah invited me because of this article that I wrote in 2021 about NFTs, where I essentially was pretty confident of my intellectual faculties and just didn't understand why people thought NFTs were conceptually deep or cool in any way. It really just seemed to me like another way to accumulate individual assets in a time when we should really be looking at how to own things collectively. And part of the article was also just documenting some, when you have a conversation at a dinner party about a new technology coming out and your friend is just going on and on about how they've already utilized, they have an NFT already up for sale, and they're gonna, the article's called For the Poisoned Dart Frog, because in this conversation my friend was like, I've created an NFT from this endangered species, and I'm going to donate all of the proceeds to the endangered species. And I just was thinking about the amount of energy that it takes to mint NFTs, the amount of energy that goes into proof of stake and proof of work, and I just was looking at him like, you must have lost the plot, or I am missing something, because we don't need to just use this application because it's available to us, especially as people that have an intellectual curiosity and some sort of value for compassion and the earth. But yeah, that's what I think about meme coins, is I try as hard as possible not to think about them and not to give them any more of my attention than is necessary. I don't see how they're connected to aesthetics. Most of the time they look pretty silly. But Gary, maybe you can enlighten me on some good looking meme coins.
I mean, I don't know. I have much enlightenment. I have, I guess, some observations. One is I just learned that you can buy a house and you can buy a property development with Solana in Dubai. I think we just I think April is now.
Should we do that? You want to go in?
I actually know a guy. I had dinner with a guy the other night. He just sat down and told me all about it. Which is itself rather extraordinary, but it's they're building something like Solana City here, like another kind of free trade zone that's based on this particular coin. I think, for me, without any kind of aesthetic in the kind of like proper judgment kind of way of thinking about it, I think the most interesting, or just unfortunately interesting, because it's probably going to keep on growing in significance, is basically agents with wallets. So like the fact that, the internet is increasingly made out of, like I already said, kind of people being fake people, but also actual fake people, like the economy, the supply chain of persona, the kind of fact that we basically now live in like an era of very, very cheap subjectivity, and subjectivity is part of going back to desire, part of the basic currency of what keeps all of this afloat outside of the kind of raw economics. There is just this, what David Graeber called like basic communism, like a desire to share, to communicate, to kind of be. And that has become, much more synthesized and synthesizable. And then the way that has significantly been bolstered is through meme coins. And so, I have a certain admiration, a certain cursedness about Daniel Keller and John Raffman's recent project Cloudy Heart, which is this sort of, I don't know how I feel about a couple of 40-year-old guys from the post-internet era making like a teenage pop star. But it is a thing, and it is kind of simultaneously, generative music, be the kind of main character, be the pop star, have a Spotify account, have a SoundCloud, have a Twitter account where you have accrue fans, and then you also trade that into a meme coin kind of like, like a degen network, and then you also trade that. I wouldn't be surprised. I think they're going to start a Switch stream. A bit risky, but I wouldn't be surprised if they go towards OnlyFans or something. This kind of way in which like automated subjective activity can kind of replace the operation of the platform economy that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, and then bringing in this kind of hyperfluidity between informational volatility and actual financial volatility, which is, meme coins for me is just this kind of mediator. And the fact that, we used to have to do all kinds of crazy things to have a wallet, and now you can actually just chat to have a Telegram bot that like manages your Solana account or something for you. This amount of, I don't really, I'm sounding like a total kind of boomer or something, but like I don't really understand what it feels like to be like a 15-year-old born into this particular circumstance and these interfaces.
You bring up a really good point though, which is that meme coins are only valuable connected to a social capital of some kind.
That is true, but it's also on the flip side, places like Dubai are apparently, you can go to, Dubai has a Solana account. They will exchange you dirhams or like USD for Solana. And so once you have an institutional guarantor like that, then you're no longer in this kind of like total decentralized Wild West. You're actually, okay, there's a central bank of Solana sort of happening, which is very striking to me, but then someone has to explain to me how Dubai works.
Well, maybe that will be made clear over the next couple of days. Thank you both so much for joining me for this session. Hope you've enjoyed it. Please give Halle and Gary a round of applause.